This is the year of the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment, at least of its passage. The mass murder in Charleston happened, and nothing was over. Now, what we don't want to happen is that it takes something like that again to get Americans thinking about the anniversaries of Reconstruction. With Reconstruction, we're going to have to force it, because most Americans don't think about Reconstruction, or for that matter, even know anything about it. Why do we have law? Why on earth do we even have government? Why do we have this deep, abiding, eternal problem of federalism and states' rights? Why do we have this deep, abiding, and probably eternal problem of race? Both of those huge, huge American dilemmas pass right through this story of how we got 3 constitutional amendments and the reimagination of the U.S. Constitution out of our Civil War. What I've asked our panel to do is to just declare their own sense from their own tradition, their own work of the most significant, powerful legacy or meaning of the 14th Amendment. We've talked about process, limitations. We've talked about the end of one kind of power, the beginning of another kind of, end of one regime, beginning of another, shining in the sun moment, the great rise and seemingly rapid fall. Why couldn't the 14th Amendment hold these great ideas within 10, 15 years of its passage? It's being eroded. How could this great revolution rise so fast and then fall so fast?
That's a great question, but even, as I said, even the 14th Amendment itself has weaknesses within it. It's compromised. It is not what the radical Republicans wanted, nor was the 15th Amendment written in the way the radical Republicans wanted. The old concepts, whether it's racism or localism, federalism, were still very much alive as they are today. Do you think the 14th Amendment could be ratified today?
No.
No. It is possible to do things in a revolutionary crisis, whether it's the end of the crisis or not, as John said, that in normal times are almost impossible to do. And I think as normality came back in some ways, the older attitudes began to reassert themselves pretty quickly. The court is already chipping away rather strongly at what the 14th Amendment is all about. So, what you could turn it around and say, how did they ever manage to get this thing passed?
Yeah.
That could be the remarkable thing, rather than the fact that it couldn't really be implemented fully over a long period of time. You could see the 14th Amendment almost as a proposed peace treaty. This is the end of the Civil War. Here's what the Civil War, and they did say, if the southern states ratify, they're back in. And Tennessee did ratify and has got its representation back. The rest of the southern states, just as stupid after the war as before, said, no, forget that. No, they'll never do anything more, so we're going to repudiate. We're going to refuse to ratify. But in a sense, it's a proposed peace treaty to end the war and have a post-war regime. But that's not how it works out, because the South refuses to accept it, and you have to then go further.
One answer to David's question would be that the 14th Amendment contains within itself, in its move away from the war footing, the seeds of the story you're telling. Because in South, Nathan Bedford Forrest is creating the Klan just as the beginning of the 14th Amendment process is underway. In South Carolina in 1870, there's going to be all-out warfare. In the Colfax Massacre of 1873, the same. And the power that the 14th Amendment leaves the federal government is not a power that can deal with this continued warfare in the same way.
The primary achievement of Reconstruction is federal supremacy. It is a revolution in the political structure of this country, with federal authority promised to displace state power when state power burdens people who had been emancipated, okay? So it's federal supremacy, and Section 1, backed up by Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which gives Congress the power to enforce the amendment through appropriate legislation. What is really being asked here is for the federal government to be a perpetual censor on state legislation, and that just cannot be. And if you think about all of the moments when the Reconstruction project have seen a decline, whether it's in Section 5 or even in the context of school desegregation, it's all about states' rights. That was a pushback against the Civil Rights Act in 1964. What are you doing to the states? How can you take away state power? So that's federalism in a word, is what I would say.
I think the real question is the inverse. How did something so radical ever even happen for a brief, shining moment? So America's Constitution is built on slavery. The Electoral College is designed to give the South basically a big inside advantage for the presidency because they get to count slaves, albeit at a 3/5 discount. 32 of the first 36 years, it's a white slave-holding Virginian in power. Pennsylvania has more free people than Virginia in 1800, way more voters than Virginia, and fewer electoral votes. You take away the extra electoral votes that Thomas Jefferson gets from slavery in 1800, John Adams wins that election. The states that get rid of slavery, even states that didn't have very much slavery, got rid of it very slowly. It takes Connecticut 50 years, New Jersey 50 years, because their entire way of life depended on foreign oil. Depended on slavery, and they couldn't easily transition away from it. Their economy did, and the North is complicit in this with shipping and insurance and banking. Everyone's profiting from it. It's the engine that drives America. So Abraham Lincoln says, 1858, it's going to take us 100 years at the least to actually put us on, because Lincoln proposes putting slavery on a path of gradual abolition.
Slave emancipation gave rise to a new conception of free personhood, that all human beings possess a fundamental right to seek amusement and to experience rapture in public by virtue simply of being human. In the era of Reconstruction, the sovereignty of the American nation-state became tethered to a new birth of a right to be an amusement seeker as embodied in the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Here was something new in the history of human rights, a guarantee of non-acquisitive happiness as the negation of chattel slavery. Consider an appeal uttered by a freeborn black man who had once been an operator of the Underground Railroad and who had led colored troops during the Civil War. He spoke of viewing The Merchant of Venice, attesting to, quote, rights and feelings that distinguished him from a brute in appreciating works of art. Quote, I feel keenly, he said. Quote, Shylock's words depict the feelings that animate with great intensity the colored man. I'm not demanding a pound of human flesh, but I am demanding exact justice as denominated in the bond between me and my government, end quote. Listen to a letter from a Virginia ex-slave to Senator Charles Sumner. He wrote, quote, look at the white man and the black man. They both have one bone, one blood. If I pay my money at a place of public entertainment, it is as good as if a white man had paid his at the same place. All that are sacred will be found in one heaven, end quote. Consider the argument of Senator Charles Sumner, the author of the 1875 Act, justifying the authority of Congress to enact the law under the Reconstruction Amendments. Quote, the Constitution is overrunning with power. It must be interpreted to advance human rights. Thus, Congress must protect this pursuit of amusement as an inviolate right of freedom.
When you think about the facts on the ground, how in a society that was imbued with white supremacy, lots of different people were implicated in undermining freedmen's rights. And so the impulse there makes sense, but in the final analysis, the Supreme Court is deeply involved in restricting the interpretation of the Reconstruction Amendments. I want to go back to the point about Section 5. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment makes Reconstruction an ongoing project, allowing Congress to respond to problems of inequality, not only of race, but of gender, all sorts of discriminations, disability, and so forth. And over time, pursuant to Section 5 authority, Congress has enacted a whole range of legislation that makes Reconstruction a project that has been live and important for all of us. So the Fair Housing Act, Section 1983, the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Violence Against Women Act, all sorts of laws that not only implicate racial inequality, not only implicate the original meaning, if we want to go to that point, of Reconstruction, but all Americans, bringing all Americans into the Reconstruction project. The second Reconstruction during the era of the 1960s is a do-over, successful in part because new voices are a part of the discussion of the meaning of the Constitution. I'm talking about the social movement actors. Dr. King, who has the ear of President Johnson. They're all a part, all of these actors are part of the context in which Congress enacts the Omnibus Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a do-over of the 1875 Civil Rights Act. The anti-discrimination norms of Reconstruction also are part of the logic of the Supreme Court upholding that Civil Rights Act. And so in the final analysis, the Reconstruction history, the Reconstruction legislation, the Reconstruction vision lives on, it gains new life during that era, even if at the Supreme Court it's understood in terms of the Commerce Clause.
I had a question about enforcement and the 14th Amendment. Professor Foner, you mentioned that there was much more debate over the third section of the 14th Amendment than the first. I'd love to hear a little bit about how much debate there was over the fifth section of the 14th Amendment.
You know, the problem is it's difficult for Congress to enforce, things going on in the states, right? I think the question is, ultimately they understood enforcement has to be at the state level. The states are supposed to abide by this. I mean, something that is so obvious we may forget it. When you put an amendment into the Constitution, you assume people are going to abide by it, right? That's the law. You don't assume that you're going to have massive resistance to the law. But ultimately, that's why the third section is basically meant to help create new governments in the South.
You don't have a huge Justice Department. It's not even created until 1870. You don't have, even today, a federal election officials being able to sort of monitor every precinct. Look at Florida in 2000. So there's very little bureaucratic capacity. And not only did the southern states feel that this was jammed down their throats, they don't have a buy-in, the Democratic Party has no buy-in either. It was jammed down its throat. Every single member of the Conservative Party in Congress votes against this. This was hatched, the 14th Amendment, in a Republican Party caucus in a secret way. It's a hyper-partisan measure, start to finish. So the South hasn't bought in, and the Democratic Party hasn't bought in, and the former white Confederacy, they have not reconciled themselves to that. So democracy works best when there's a buy-in, when the losers admit that they lost.
There was a need for new legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think today, with movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, there's still a need to grow the legislation or just enforce these two acts better?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great question. So the question is whether today, with new movements like Black Lives Matter, are there enough laws on the books to address their concerns, or must there be new legislation? And what I would say is, I think it would be fabulous if the laws that already protect citizens against excessive police use of force were implemented. I also think that there's some utility in new legislation, but I don't necessarily think that it's needed. This is a problem of law on the ground, and law being in the hands of officers who have, tremendous discretion. It's really not a situation, for the most part, I think, where there needs to be some positive legislation. It's really an issue of human rights and buy-in to the norms that already exist.
The second Reconstruction, as the civil rights era is often called, needed was to just enforce what the Constitution we actually have and have had since Reconstruction. And it's probably the case now that there are plenty of laws on the books about equal treatment before the law and police brutality and all that kind of stuff, but they're not being enforced. If new laws might not be enforced very well either, you know, that's the problem.
Gandhi was once asked, we do have, I think, a lot of good laws already on the books. Gandhi was once asked what he thought about Western civilization,
Yes.
and he paused and he said he thought it would be a good idea.
So all of you are very distinguished historians whose job is to examine history and not necessarily predict the future. But obviously, as we mark the 150th anniversary of ratification of the 14th Amendment, its legacy and the fight over it lives on. And you brought up Shelby County, the Supreme Court case, and voter suppression as it's happening right now. There are a lot of things that are affecting, millions of people right now that are all tied up. And I'm wondering, given your incredible insights into American politics and American history and American constitutional law, what is the most effective way of, really reclaiming what the actual intent of the 14th Amendment was and making sure that people can vote and doing that kind of stuff? So what is the most effective way of moving forward and affecting real change in the future?
So this is a way of understanding the gay rights movement, for instance, and the incredible success over a very short period of time. It's people who are mobilized, who draw on the civil rights movement and what it's taught, and who demand full participation, full citizenship. That's people on the ground.
But even if it weren't going on, the question also is, we're going to go back to Citizens United. As long as, right, if you really want to get into this, as long as you have a political system that's dominated by corporate money, right, even if you have the right, how free is the execution of that?
On mobilization, Martin King mobilized, but he actually mobilized claiming the text. He actually said there were promises made in this document. And he wouldn't have been able to give that same speech in South Africa at that time because the South African government didn't make those promises in its constitution. Its constitution actually said the basis of our system is racial separation. And the basis of this one is actually equality of many sorts. It doesn't even limit itself to equality. So actually, if you're going to mobilize, I think this is a rallying point for mobilization, and you should claim your history, all of it, including the history of Reconstruction and the progressive amendments, because actually the other folks on the other side claim the Constitution. The problem is they haven't read it and they don't know its history. It's actually a radical document for its time in 1787, and all the amendments, with the exception of prohibition, are basically, which didn't work, added to liberty and equality. And it's actually, it should, it's like what Gandhi said about Western civilization, it sounds like a good idea. The stuff in here that's already in here is pretty good and because this history is actually correct in a way that the Dunning School history actually isn't. And that is power to actually have the history of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments on our side.
All right.